Hell in the Halls, the sinister truth of early 20th century Asylums. In the shadowy recesses of America's history lies a chapter as chilling as any horror novel, the era of the asylum. Before the reforms of the mid-20th century, psychiatric hospitals were not places of healing, they were places of despair, isolation, and unimaginable suffering. These sprawling institutions, often tucked away on the outskirts of towns, became dumping grounds for the unwanted, the poor, the misunderstood, the inconvenient. The asylums promised safety. What they delivered was systematic torture cloaked as treatment. By the early 1900s, psychiatric hospitals were bursting at the seams. Facilities meant to hold 300 might house 3,000. Patients were crammed into filthy dormitories, sleeping on lice-infested straw or bare floors. The smell of human waste, vomit, and mildew filled the air. There was no privacy, no silence, only chaos. Steedy Lewis Insane Asylum, for instance, could not cope with its population boom. Lacking funds and staff, it began shipping patients to the city poorhouse, a grim warehouse for the destitute, where they were left to rot without any medical attention. It wasn't a transfer, it was a death sentence. Behind thick stone walls, horror reigned. Under the guise of medical progress, doctors and attendants administered cruel, experimental therapies that pushed patients beyond pain and sometimes into death. Hydrotherapy was one of the most common tools of torment. Patients were forced into freezing cold baths for hours, stripped naked and submerged until their lips turned blue and their bodies trembled uncontrollably. The icy water was said to calm hysteria. What it truly did was induce shock, pneumonia, and despair. Electroshock therapy in its primitive stages was closer to state-sanctioned torture. Patients were restrained and subjected to violent electrical currents that convulsed their bodies. Bones were broken, teeth were shattered. The trauma was both physical and psychological, leaving patients blank-eyed and incoherent. Insulin shock therapy induced daily comas. The patient, injected with dangerously high levels of insulin, would slip into unconsciousness. Some suffered brain damage, some never woke up. And then there was the lobotomy, a cold, calculated mutilation of the mind. Using crude tools like ice picks, doctors severed the frontal lobes of the brain through the eye socket. These procedures were performed in assembly line fashion on patients who were anxious, disobedient, or simply inconvenient. Many emerged as shells void of personality, stripped of thought, emotion, or identity. Nellie Bly, the brave woman who exposed the nightmare. The first true glimpse into the abyss came in 1887, when pioneering journalist Nellie Bly dared to infiltrate the system itself. Pretending to be insane, she had herself committed to the Women's Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell's Island in New York City. What she found inside was a horror house. Bly endured the very same torment as the other women. She was forced to sit for hours on cold, hard benches, forbidden to speak, and screamed at for the smallest movements. The food was unrecognizable gray, congealed slop swimming with bugs, served with contaminated water that stank of rot. She witnessed nurses drag women by their hair, slap them until their faces bled, and laugh while doing it. One woman, unable to speak English, was beaten daily because staff claimed her silence was defiance. Many women showed no signs of mental illness, they had simply been poor, foreign, or inconvenient wives. Bly's haunting expos, later published as 10 Days in a Madhouse, caused national outrage. For the first time, the public saw what these institutions truly were: warehouses of abuse, camouflaged as hospitals. Thanks to Bly, funding was increased, reforms were demanded, and the seeds of accountability were planted, but the rot ran deep, and many institutions continued unchecked for decades. Straitjackets were not the last resort. They were daily attire. Patients were bound so tightly their skin split. Some died in restraints, their bodies contorted in agonized final poses. Isolation cells, tiny, pitch-black rooms, were used to punish those who cried out. Some inmates were locked in for weeks, fed through a slit in the door, their only company, the rats. Starvation was common. The meals were sporadic and inedible. Food trays were often used as punishment, taunted in front of patients and then withdrawn. Sanitation was non-existent. Feces and vomit lined the floors in some wards. Infestations of lice and fleas ravaged already weakened bodies. And then came the sexual predators, attendants who raped and molested patients with impunity. Women who became pregnant were forced to undergo crude, backroom abortions or had their newborns taken and disappeared. Perhaps the most sinister truth of all, many of these people were never mentally ill. They were poor individuals who couldn't afford housing, immigrants who didn't speak English and were misunderstood or feared, women whose husbands or fathers found them unruly or embarrassing, LGBTQ+ people accused of perversion and sent to be cured, children with epilepsy or disabilities, labeled defective and discarded. Their only crime was being different. The asylum erased them. Some patients escaped not physically, but emotionally through madness, the only true defense against constant horror. Others committed suicide using whatever means they could: shards of broken plates, twisted linens, sharp corners of the walls. By the 1960s, deinstitutionalization had begun, driven by public outrage, the rise of psychiatric medication, and growing awareness of patients' rights. Many of the great asylums were shuttered. Some were demolished. Others stand abandoned, haunted in every sense of the word. Danvers State Hospital, Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, Penhurst, and others now attract ghost hunters and historians alike. Visitors report hearing disembodied screams, footsteps in empty corridors, doors slamming where no one walks. Are the dead trying to speak, or merely replaying their trauma in an endless loop? Today, mental health care has improved, but the scars of the asylum era remain. Stigma still clings. Underfunded institutions still struggle. Homelessness, misdiagnosis, and lack of resources echo the old sins. The asylums are gone, but their ghosts are very real, lingering not just in crumbling buildings, but in our collective memory, and in the courage of people like Nellie Bly, who dared to speak the truth when others looked away. Of all the terrors lurking within the asylum system, none were more grotesque or more silenced than the systematic sexual abuse of patients. In a world where the voiceless were locked away and disbelieved by design, the predators thrived. Doctors, attendants, and orderlies, men tasked with care, became tormentors, exploiting the institutional shadows to commit acts of unfathomable cruelty. The patients, often drugged, restrained, or considered insane, had no means to resist and no one to believe them if they tried. It was not uncommon for women, particularly young, unaccompanied women, to be subjected to nighttime visits from staff. These assaults took place in locked wards, behind closed doors, in the silence enforced by power and sedation. Many patients were dosed with sedatives, not for treatment but for control and compliance. Once docile and dazed, they were groped, molested, or raped, their protests dismissed as delusions. If a woman tried to report it, her claims were recorded as hallucinations, paranoia, or symptoms of erotomania, a supposed delusional disorder in which the patient imagined sexual encounters. There was no justice, no escape, just whispers, sobs, and blood-stained sheets washed in the dark. Some of these assaults led to pregnancies, a consequence the institutions were ill-prepared to hide, yet desperate to conceal. When a patient began to show, she was often isolated in locked wards, away from prying eyes, forced into a therapeutic abortion, a grotesque euphemism for a botched, unmedicated procedure, often carried out by unqualified staff. Or, if the baby was born, the infant was taken immediately, disappeared, sometimes sold to orphanages or quietly buried without records. The mothers were labeled unfit and left to rot. In many cases, no one on the outside ever knew what had happened. Some institutions kept secret wings or basements where these women were confined for the rest of their lives, punished for their own victimhood, hidden away so the shame would not touch the administration. Though women were the primary targets, they were not the only victims. Male patients, especially younger boys and teens, were frequently preyed upon by male attendants. Patients with intellectual disabilities, those unable to speak, or who were heavily medicated, were seen as easy victims. Those who resisted faced beatings, starvation, or isolation. Others were restrained and subjected to aversion therapies meant to cure them of their imagined delusions, further traumatizing them under the guise of treatment. And there were no consequences. Staff were rarely investigated. Institutions protected their own. Many survivors left the asylums only to live with lifelong trauma, terrified to speak, or too ashamed. Others never left at all. Maggie, a 19-year-old committed for melancholy, was repeatedly raped by an orderly who later blamed her, saying she had seduced him. When she became pregnant, the hospital labeled her morally insane and lobotomized her. She lived the next 43 years as a near-vegetative shell. Anna, an immigrant from Poland, could not speak English. She was gang raped by attendants in a basement ward. When she tried to fight back, her wrists were broken. Her cries were documented as manic episodes. These are not just stories, they are echoes from the past. Some recorded in old court records, others buried in dusty ledgers, redacted reports, and testimonies smothered by shame. Perhaps the souls of those abused, silenced, and erased have not found peace. Perhaps they are still waiting for justice, for remembrance, or simply to be heard. The story of sexual abuse in asylums is a hidden atrocity, one often overshadowed by tales of lobotomies and electroshock. But it is perhaps the most horrifying element of all, a betrayal of power, an exploitation of the voiceless, and a reminder that the worst evil can wear a doctor's coat and carry a clipboard. And though the asylums are closed, the system that enabled their horrors, silencing the vulnerable, ignoring abuse, and calling pain madness still echoes in places where justice falters. My name is Penny Flick, with Kreep-ish. I'll be back with more stories that challenge our perceptions, question reality, and keep us peering into the darkness of history. Comment below on your thoughts. What stories intrigue you the most? What mysteries do you want to uncover? Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, the truth is often stranger than fiction.